an example of just how much. And this is one of, how many do we have downstairs? 4 or 5?
At least, yes.
Okay, so this is just one example of all of the documents we've received in this public records request. And
Here's another. And by the way, if you've ever wanted to go to sleep real fast, just start leafing through bank statements. Really scintillating, exciting stuff.
well, this one is the archive document from July 2025 to June 2026, and we have another one that is for Bessemer, because these funds that we've been looking into is broken up by division, Birmingham and Bessemer, and we're talking about the archival discretionary fund. So explain to us what this is.
I will, but let me just say, I've never seen Morgan look at a ruler more since like arithmetic class, right? I mean, line by line, we've been looking at this stuff.
I know, you're like doing everything, you're very techie, and I'm over there like it's 1990.
And that's why it makes a good partnership, or 1950, whatever, yes. Okay, so there's 2 funds here, but they're all for the same purpose. They were created by state statute back in 2012. The idea is Jefferson County, the oldest, the largest county in our state, has literally millions of pages of documents that go back 200 years in some cases, and they're all decaying because they're on paper, maybe even papyrus, I don't know, on microfilm, all things that degrade, and so they were trying to find a way to be able to preserve that and didn't have enough money to do it. So the state, as it has in several other counties, created a fund where when you go down and have a record processed through probate, wills, licenses, whatever deeds, things like that, you pay an $11 fee. That money goes into these archival funds, and the state law says the purpose of it is to preserve, digitize it, preserve these records, and also for the improvement of the office, and that's a key phrase we'll get into. But that's what the money was intended to do.
And we have found that through Judge Blanchard's tenure of 16 months or so, was in office before her suspension, that her office spent about at least $3.5 million out of both of those funds.
And the question, of course, is what kind of pace is that on? It's about $229,000 a month in spending for those 16 months, a rate that we found to be much higher than her predecessors, according to a state audit, and certainly than some other probate courts around the state that we have surveyed, and that's why we kind of looked at the rate. The spend rate was, we figured about $1, and for every dollar that they took in that term, they spent about $1.19. So that's why the fund was dropping. They also moved some money around to other accounts, investment accounts. The other courts we looked at had a spend rate of, I think, like 43 cents, 41 cents in Mobile and Madison counties, which are not as big as Jefferson County, but bigger counties in our state, who also have these archival funds. I think Coleman was about the same, or some were 20 cents. But all of them and her predecessors were all, you're looking at Grady, I know, right?
Sorry.
Their predecessors were all spending money at a much, much slower rate compared to what Judge Blanchard's tenure was in the 16 months. Then the question becomes, what was it being spent on? That's what certainly got some of our attention as well.
Yes, and I'm sorry for that. I was really trying not to get distracted.
It's
You did a
all
great
good.
job. But my son is here, breaking.
He's breaking that down too,
To break
right?
away
Yeah.
from what we're talking about, we have some end of summer care issues, and so
It's just Camp WBRC
it
here
is,
today, right?
it is.
It's a lot of fun.
And so that I was trying not to get distracted, but I'm a parent, so.
Okay, so
It is.
of the $3.8 million that were
Yes.
spent, what you really dug into was 2 of the biggest expenditures, which were these consulting contracts for CBG strategies and Green Consulting. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
What did you find there?
Green Consulting Group. So again, the amount of money that we have is going back to some of 2024 and 2025. We do not have the contracts yet for 2025. We have for 2026. But for Green Consulting Group, this is an agency based out of Huntsville. They have received $461,000 and $461,000. I'm reading this totally wrong. It was more than $460,000, and then for CBG Strategies, it was $637,000. CBG Strategies is a Birmingham-based firm, and that was the highest amount awarded out of any sort of company paid through either of these funds with CBG Strategies.
And I'm showing our viewers the story we have that breaks down the payments, the different payments and the dates we've got for those particular 2 firms. We kind of dug into those contracts, and you dug into Mr. Green's background here. But if you want to look at, we've got a complete section for all our coverage on WBRC.com, our WBRC News app that includes a listing of those payment dates, when they were paid out, what they were for, and that's where these begin to get interesting, because the probate court covers a lot of different services, And that is particularly, you would think of it for anytime you have a big life event, a birth, a death, a marriage, those sort of things. But it also has some roles in elections, but that's where things begin to get a little interesting, because that's where a lot of these expenditures were related for those two specifically.
If we want to take a second to look at the contract between the probate office and Green, just some of the things that they were hired to do and the deliverables that were expected as part of that contract. And the contract for 2026 that we have is for $350,000, and some of the deliverables were that Mr. Green was supposed to help with election security preparedness, prepare election cyber incident communication plan, prepare and implement election kiosks throughout the county to increase access to voter registration, and then also to process improvement recommendations for voter registration and election day. There was also part of some of the expected outcomes was to reduce wait times and confusion on election day due to better planning and education, and was supposed to be working specifically with poll workers. So one of the functions of the probate office is she is the election officer.
Chief elections officer in some ways, but
Yes.
kind of as an umbrella, because as you said, there's many parts of the county that have different roles. The sheriff's in charge of securing the
Yes.
ballot boxes. The registrar is in charge of, which is Barry Stevenson in our county, is in charge of making sure the voter rolls are up to date, right? Everybody has different roles to play, so the probate court is sort of overall that, but has a narrow lane that they're operating in.
Correct. And so the major function of the contract with Green Consultant was election-based consulting. And with CBG, the Birmingham base, that was a more, there were a lot, it was a more broad, they were doing more types of work for the office instead of just being focused on one thing like the Green contract.
And some of that, we're talking about some of the expenditures from this related to elections. There was a big mailer that was about 70,000 mailers, I think, that were produced. There's one number that says 40,000, but I think it's 70,000 is the actual number. But anyway, a lot of those mailers, and we've got a copy of at least one of them. Not sure if they're all the same, but it basically has a big picture of Judge Blanchard. And by the way, pictures and photography is another something we'll get into. A picture of her, and then says something about elections. And there's also several tens of thousands of dollars spent. I won't give you an exact number, but with a couple of local radio ownership groups for advertising related to elections. And that was a buy that was done in, I'm going to say March, but it started in May and was going to run all the way through November the 3rd of this year, talking about elections, and included some live interviews and stuff as these packages. I know one was about $14,000 and one was in that neighborhood. All elections related, but all, according to other folks who have been in the office before, a departure from what they've done in the past. Fair?
That I would say that that's fair.
Okay.
Some of the things that CBG was supposed to do, they had an on-site administrative coordinator, an internal and external communications. A big focus was also on media engagement services, and we saw some line items in there related to that, social media engagement and management, and then just having someone, again, who was on site in the probate court helping with the flow of the day-to-day functions was what they were doing. And you talked to the person who's in charge or the owner of CBG, and they said that they had no comment about this.
Right.
I tried to get a hold of Samuel Green and have him explain, what he was doing, and we were on the phone, and after I identified myself, the phone got disconnected, and then he has not responded to emails that you sent or that I sent.
Yep. We've had a crew go by, go by his office.
At our sister station, WAFF, a reporter there told me that they got a phone call back from him, and that he said he had no comment and to direct all questions to the probate court, which of course is in a interesting situation now by having appointed probate judges in place of Judge Blanchard because she has been suspended again. That's unrelated to the spending that we have found here and are talking about today.
And again, we're talking about the number is $461,000 that went to him of a contract that was supposed to be paying what, $150 a quarter or something. I mean, it was going to be there was a lot paid already, relatively speaking, and there was more on the books. And what we haven't gotten very clear, I think, either, it's important to note, is the status of these contracts as they sit today, right? They were in action when the judge was suspended back in May. What has happened to those contracts, because both the CBG and the Green contracts called for quarterly payments and for those to continue. The length of those contracts was at least through this calendar year, right? And
Correct.
So is the court still paying them? Is something we can't really get a good answer on yet, but are trying to. And again, the other question to remember in all this is Not necessarily, do you think this is what the court should be spending money on? That's perhaps one question, but it is the source of the funds and what those funds were specifically supposed to do. And I'll read you, in fact, let me pull up here. This is the state statute. We all like reading law online, right? This is super exciting. But let me just highlight specifically, these fees should be deposited. They can be used for the payment of salaries for confidential judicial assistance, improved indexing, recording, archiving, and retrieving systems and other equipment. And then here's the key phrase, maintenance and services necessary for the improvement of the office of the judge of probate. That's kind of the wiggle room, if you will, in the statute, is services and maintenance necessary for the improvement of the office of the judge of probate. So, do you think that advertising, do you think that some other personal expenditures, $6,000 for senior fit classes, $20,000 for stress balls, $10,000 for photography of the judge, her staff, and an event that she's hosting, which is all in here, does that fit that definition? Not for us to say, certainly perhaps for somebody to figure out, because that is the question now is, this was a pot of money, what was it being spent on, and was it what was supposed to be?
Well, you've gotten perspective from other probate judges, past probate judges, who say that a lot of the spending that they have seen that we have explained to them is improper for what the fund was intended. And our other investigative reporter, Jen Horton, is requesting these same documents from other probate judges so we can have a better comparison. But so far, what you've been able to find is there has not been another level of spending like what we have seen in Jefferson County.
Yeah, the rate is certainly much different. And in fact, what's of note, we haven't even talked about this yet, but if you looked at the flow of spending, the first 3 months of this Judge Blanchard's tenure there in 2025, the fund was still growing by, say, $40,000 or $50,000 a month relatively. There was output versus income. And then about 3 months in, that turned negative, and it began to spend more than they were taking in for the rest of the time. And if you look at this funds just began in 2012, and for most of its history that we can track at this point up to 2022, it was growing every year by significant amounts. They were collecting more than they were spending on archiving these records. And I talked to Judge King, who was the probate judge who helped lobby for this law when it was passed, and said by the time he left office and retired in 2020, they had gotten up to maybe the 60s or 70s in terms of archiving records, but it's kind of a never-ending process because every day there are thousands of new pages of records being produced, and they're trying to play catch-up on that. So it's kind of an unfillable hole in some ways. But they had made a lot of progress on that, and that's why the money kept coming in and they were holding it. But he talked about the approval process, and even though you have the probate judge is ultimately in charge of the spending from these funds, governed by this law, he said anything that he spent out of that fund, he would go get an approving opinion basically from the county attorney and also from the state auditor's office before they did anything. They did some office renovations, expanded the mental health section using some of these funds while he was still there, but he said he just thought it was important to handle things that way. And we've seen some other counties where there's a similar sort of approval process. In fact, Jen just got off the phone with, I think it was Mobile, right, that they were talking about. They had spent, I think it was like $20,000. There's a couple.
I think it was $10,000.
Okay, it was not a lot.
Yeah.
It was 5 figures. Okay, and they were a little nervous about spending that much because that was going to leave like 1.6 million in their fund, right?
Yeah.
So, and that was on a technology piece that was specifically for archiving. So, certainly the level of spending and the wide variety of things that was being spent on, we have not been able to find anything comparable.
No, but one thing I want to go over really quickly is the audit that we have covered in some of our stories and referenced as the one kind of point of reference that we do have, or point of comparison that we have so far with those other pending records requests for previous year spending in the Jefferson County probate, is the one from the state audit. And that was 2017 to 2022. And they broke down spending by category, so we don't have the line items like we do for Judge Blanchard's time in the probate office, but we can go over some of the like professional dues just in the Birmingham division for those 4 years, $71,000. And for the 16 months or so that we have funding, it's $79,000. The biggest difference, or the biggest amount of money spent, what is it? Almost 60% of the total amount of money spent during Judge Blanchard's tenure, is for professional services at $2.2 million. And that's compared to Birmingham $755,000, 964, and that is from those 4 years.
Right.
And professional services, some of the things that they had listed as the professional services was the senior event that you talked about, the professional headshots that were $450 a piece, the total $10,000 package to that one photographer. There was
portraits.
There was two portraits, $6,000. There was a portrait and headshot of Judge Blanchard that was $1,200, and those were all listed as professional services. So there's, like you mentioned, a broad category that was being lumped under that one category.
And we're trying our best to do apples to apples comparisons as much as we can, which is why we're pointing out that state audit, which we should also point out there is a new state audit underway right now that was launched in March. The state says it's unrelated to any of the rest of this. It's part of a routine audit. It's basically their turn in the schedule to be audited, perhaps conveniently. But we're trying to do apples to apples, so you have these broad categories. We don't have the line items, as you were saying. But for instance, so we found in some of Judge Blanchard's records that there was about almost $6,000, $5,500, spent on 2 judges' chairs, each at like $2,100, $2,400, something a piece, which sounds like a pretty expensive daggum chair, right? But what are judges' chairs priced at? I haven't been in the market for one. We both judge people for a living, but we don't have judges' chairs, right? So I don't know what the going rate for that is. Maybe that is what those very nice chairs cost. But that just sounds, and they were special order, we do see that in the invoices, that sounds like a whole lot of money.
Well,
does that come under this clause, I guess is the question.
Well, another point of comparison, again, it was broken down with the audit. Office equipment and furniture for 2017 to 2022 was $58,000, and then for Judge Blanchard, it's $265,000. So that's just a difference when you're talking about that. But there has been a lot of ongoing projects that started before her tenure, with some of the renovations to create more room for the. There's one project underway that started before that is to add more vertical filing.
Yeah, there's a lot of filing cabinets in there, right?
And then the line item for the vertical filing was $565,000.
Which sounds really expensive. But then when you think about what I'm told the size of some of those records rooms are, maybe that is what you need to be able to store those. We just don't have a good comparison.
The $565 was paid by the county commission, was paid and approved by the county commission. So that's part of some of the ongoing work. Like we said, our data that we have is from 2024. She took over in January 2025.
So again, we're trying to be transparent about what we do have, what we do know, what we still need to know. There are still lots of questions. As we look at more records, we got some more this week, in fact, we're trying to compare, okay? And in these financial records, like, they sort of overlap, right? We've had different things. We're trying to sort what's new, what's not. What do we know? What do we still need to know? And we've got more records requests out there. We're expecting more documents, and we will keep those. We'll keep you informed as we learn more, as we get through these. We'll be as transparent with you as we can. And again, we should point out that all of what we're talking about, the spending is not the subject of any active investigation that we're aware of other than our own. All of the charges that Judge Blanchard faces is in the Judicial Inquiry Commission, and that's all about how she was managing or allegedly not managing the caseload for her court. The flow of cases for people who have mental health, they're being retained in mental health facilities, they have to have competency hearings, they have estates to be probated, that sort of thing. That's what she's being charged with, is not running that docket correctly, and ethics charges related to that. So again, everything that she's been suspended for has nothing to do with the finances to this point. It is just another piece of the puzzle. We're trying to get a sense of what was happening in that office for those 16 months.
And as you mentioned, the JIC and what was going on with the running of the probate office. We now have something on our website. I don't know if you'd be able to pull it up so we can show.
Yeah, I can.
We just launched it this week, and we are hoping people who have used the probate office over the past 16 months will share what their experience was like. There are a lot of allegations against Judge Blanchard, which she denies, and through her attorney denying all of those allegations. But we're trying to get the stories that are mentioned in that complaint, where they're talking about people being when they have those, it's right there. So when they're talking about involuntary commitments, there's been some really heartbreaking stories where people say that they had a really tough time getting a hearing for very serious cases. And so we're asking if you had any dealings with the probate court, to fill out this form that we have on our website right now. This is if you go up here, will you do the cursor just so people can find it? On your side, if you click there, it's one of the first stories that you see. And right there, yep, it's the first one. It might change it in the next couple of hours or days, or who knows, we're putting a bunch of new stuff in, but we have a couple questions in here. You can put your information in. If you want to be contacted back, then we would love that, and we can talk to you. Just are trying to get those stories as we are continuing to investigate every angle of this situation.
Yeah, really, the whole point of all of this data that we're looking at is to try and tell a story for your dollars, where your money is being spent. But the biggest impact, of course, it appears so far has been people, and that's the kind of stories we want to tell and be able to give a perspective on. So that's why we're seeking this kind of input, because we have heard anecdotally of some cases, and these are sensitive matters, right? If you're in the probate court, it's almost always a very personal thing that you're enduring. So we're trying to respect people's privacy, but also want to be able to get a better sense of what was it like before and after, right? Was there a difference, and what was the impact on people? We've heard anecdotally a lot of these stories. Now, if you can share your experience, that would help us tell that story too.
And this is if you were someone who was in the probate court in a professional or a personal manner. We've heard from some attorneys just their experiences, but if you had any dealings with the probate court and you want to share your story, we would love to listen to it. All
right, so we have continued our reporting here on WBRC.com and our WBRC News app. We will continue these live streams as we get new data in. Morgan's got her ruler ready, I've got my computer ready, and we'll try and nerd out even more and make it as easily digestible as we can. There's just a lot of information here we're trying to comb through for you. If you have questions, reach out to us. We're happy to try and answer those, and definitely reach out to us here on this story here in our Jot forum. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah. Thank you.